So I'm doing something a little different this week on the Beer Atlantic. We're doing a bit of a follow-up episode on the Wort Wars episode and on the first batch double. I'm going to evaluate them both. In fact, tonight's the Wort Wars itself at the club night, so we'll see how I did. So stay tuned for a little follow-up action on the Beer Atlantic. In episode 9, I traveled to Milkhouse Brewery with other members of my homebrew club as part of an experiment in creating distinct beers from the same wort. So what about me? What the hell am I making? I'm going to try to make a fake-out saison. So what I did was I took some yeast from that dubbel that I shot a couple weeks ago, brought some left over, and I'm going to let that tear through this wort like a son of a gun. To try to fake out the saison flavor, since I'm not using an actual saison yeast, I brought some spices with me. Some orange peel, some ginger root, and some grains of paradise to try to get those yeast characters I'm not going to get from my Belgian yeast. And to dry it out, because I want a saison to be nice and dry, I'm going to add some Belgian candy sugar. It brings up the fermentability, brings down the body. Hopefully we'll get something that passes for a saison. Well, the moment of truth has arrived. Club night in Frederick. And we've all brought our respective variations on theme for the other club members to try out. Each entry was assigned a number, and the club voted on their favorite entry. The results were announced at the end of the meeting. Beer number one.
Beer number one.
We do beer number one.
Beer number one.
Oh, well, what do you know? It won. Overall, the field was high quality. IPAs and pale ales were the most common interpretation for this year's Wort Wars, but a humble saison seemed to have won the hearts over. So that was a ton of fun. It was really interesting to see all the different beers everyone made. And it was really, I guess, heartening to know that my plan worked. The Belgian candy sugar did dry out the beer, made it less thick and gummy, which is what I wanted. And ultimately, I think I came up with a good summer ale, which may not necessarily taste like a saison, but tasted like something that tasted good. And I think really that's the focus whenever you're in the hobby. You want to try to experiment, but you gotta make a good beer. Well, enough of that. Let's revisit another episode. If you recall, the third episode we discussed how to do stovetop homebrews, and I made a Belgian double from a kit from Northern Brewer. Well, today I thought I'd revisit it since the beer is all fermented up. It's time to do a little quick taste test, put myself under my own rigorous evaluation and see how I did. So let's see how this goes. Very foamy. That's a lot of foam. Lots of things could cause that, technically. Usually, if you look at this much foam, there's two things at play. Either a wild yeast, which I can tell you is not the case here. There's no aroma or indications of wild yeast. It could have been that it was bottled with too much sugar, so it's overcarbonated. As I did bottle condition these beers. We're gonna let this sit down for a little bit. So check out the color on this thing. Just right. It's about a light mahogany. Doubles go anywhere from the light browns to a nice deep, brown with garnet notes to it. Let's take this in steps. The appearance, a very long-lasting head, bit too much head. I would call this overcarbonated at the moment, but it is a nice, luscious, long-lasting head, which you expect from a Belgian. The color is right in the style. A little hazy from chill haze because I didn't bother with a lot of clarification agents. It was just a stovetop brew. Remember, this is like someone's very first beer. So I'm going to be merciless, but I'm going to know exactly what went wrong if it went wrong. Let's move on to aroma. A little peppery with some plum notes, a bit of a malty, I won't call it caramel. It's more of a sweet bread. There's not a ton of the Belgian yeast character, which is what you would expect from a Trappist ale like this. So it didn't carry through quite in the aroma. And I think I would picked it up with all this head here. So I think we've killed the head enough. Let's give it a taste. The first thing you taste is a bit of the malt, and it's a bit of an unsophisticated malt note. I think largely because of the extract. I did steep some grains, but it wasn't a long steep. It was more of a 15 to 20 minute steep, just as it rose to a certain temperature. That was meant to be effectively quick to give enough flavor. Truth of the matter is, if you want more complexity in your beer, you're going to want that grain to stay and give you a little more of the grain character. A lot longer than we did with our very first batch beer. Other notes. Those Belgian yeast notes that were missing from the aroma have shown up in the flavor, happily, because it was, a genuine Belgian yeast that we pitched. It is a bit more phenolic than ester, which means that we have a lot of the pepperiness, a little bit of clove note, not the fruity kind of esters that you get that are peculiar to the Belgians. So why did that happen? A lot of that has to do with temperature of the fermentation. The temperature of fermentation does affect the chemicals that the yeast puts out. My temperature lended to the cold because I brewed this in March, and it was freezing cold this March. Therefore, the yeast didn't get to a high enough level to start kicking out a lot of the esters. If I brewed one now, it would probably be a little more ester driven, less phenolic driven. One more note though. I'm getting some hot alcohol notes. These would be fusel alcohols. This is a product of what I would call a stressed out yeast. Either too hot, which obviously wasn't the case, or it could have been underpitched. Remember this? That was pitched directly from the pack. Usually, if I was making a beer for real for competitions, I would make a starter. Starters do a lot for you. Starters proof the yeast, make sure it's alive and viable. It also ups your cell count. And there is a degree at which yeast will propagate and then stop and begin to consume the sugars. The quicker the yeast gets to the point where it's consuming sugars, the less stressed it is and the more clean a fermentation you get. This is not exactly a clean fermentation. Now this is a high alcohol beer, relatively speaking. However, the kinds of alcohols matter. I'm not getting all of the proper alcohols, I'm getting some of the higher alcohols. Now this beer will calm down in a couple months. As a matter of fact, I think come Thanksgiving time, this would be a fantastic beer to pour, especially for the minimum effort we put into it. So what have we learned about your very first batch of beer? Temperature matters, absolutely matters, how hot it is when it ferments. Your yeast health matters. It's always better to make sure you've got plenty of yeast, either by pitching more packs or by creating a starter. And of course, if you're wanting to make a real serious beer with a degree of complexity, you're going to want to start looking into moving into partial mashes where you're allowing the grains to really exist inside that wort to impart all those flavors. But that said, for an inexpensive kit, for a minimum amount of effort, and just a few weeks worth of fermentation and conditioning, you have a palatable, enjoyable beverage, which is a genuine craft beer that you made. There are ways we can improve, but then again, that'll be for your next batch. Well, thanks for joining me this week on a recap episode of the Beer Atlantic. Next week, we're going to be for real going down and visiting a new brewery and seeing how they're doing. In the meantime, I'm JP Sloan for the Beer Atlantic. Cheers. And of course, make sure the ice cream man shows up during your film shoot. Good guy. We're not in Kansas anymore.